You're listening to a
You're
small
listening
good
to-
thing.
listening to a small
You're
good
listening
thing.
to a small
To a small good thing.
Good
The
thing.
Small Good Thing with Steve Zelt.
with Steve Zelt.
I'm Steve Zelt. Dr. Alison Baker is professor of medieval and classical literature at Cal Poly Pomona. That's a state university that lies just on the eastern edge of Los Angeles County. She teaches courses in myth, epic, and medieval literature. In 2014, she received the Provost Award for Excellence in Teaching. The Provost Award is awarded to one professor every year who demonstrates outstanding success in, quote, student performance, innovative teaching methods, and active involvement in student learning outside the classroom, end quote. And I can tell you from my own experience that she certainly qualifies on these counts because before she was my friend, she was one of my teachers at Cal Poly, all these many years ago. Since graduating from Cal Poly, I have observed her friendly Facebook posts, and I know that she's deeply interested in reading to children and for children, to young people, reading in general for what it does for everyone. I love children and I am a reader, and that's one of the reasons I asked her if she would be on my show. I talked to her by phone last August. Thanks for being on the show, Dr. Baker.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm delighted. Thank you for asking me.
Listen, before I get to my main subject, which is why reading and stories are good for us, maybe you would just tell us a little bit about your job and what it is that you do.
I read cool things and talk about them with wonderful people. I get people hooked on old literature who maybe haven't run across it before or who think it's old and foreign and not contemporary and hip and cool and relevant. And I try to make them see that we're all still talking and worrying and laughing about the same things that people were thousands of years ago. You know, grief and joy and kids and drama, they're all sort of continuous. We haven't reinvented problems. You know, the reason Facebook quizzes and things like that are telling us which Ninja Turtle are you or which Game of Thrones character are you is because we all sort of fit into types. And once you realize the patterns, oh, that's this character, this is the villain, this is the sidekick, this is the whatever. You kind of realize how you deal with those people and what you learn from those people and we do need conflict. We do need to deal with conflict because there's always going to be somebody stirring the pot. So there were people stirring the pot in the Canterbury Tales. You know, there were people who were rude and crass. There were people who were disrespectful. There were people who were trying to look better than they are. Those people still exist. You see them in Harry Potter, or you see them in Game of Thrones, or you see them at the supermarket, or you see them online. So those stories really haven't changed all that much, and what we get from them hasn't changed all that much, I don't think.
Okay, so here's the deal, Alison. What I want to do is I want to talk about on this episode, I think is kind of a hard sell. I want to see if I can move the needle a little bit in convincing people about the value of reading. And so I cleverly enlisted you to come to my aid because I think the challenge is this. I think that telling people that they ought to read more is like telling them that they ought to eat more vegetables or that they ought to do some physical exercise every day. Everybody agrees to that. Yet acknowledging that something is good for us doesn't always seem to translate into changing our behavior. I think most people would agree with the proposition that reading is good for us in some sense. Yet I'm afraid that fewer and fewer people are actually reading. Maybe, maybe not. My question is this to you. Can we help people to read? Is that possible? Is reading good for us? And if so, how? And in what ways? What does reading do for us?
Okay, first, let me unpin your metaphors. Yes, we can. And people will eat vegetables, but they have to be, if they're not drawn to them, they have to be changed a little bit. They have to be covered in cheese sauce, or they have to be riced into something that they can't tell. But they will do it, and it's good for them. And exercise is the same way, right? So if you find the thing that the person loves, they will do that. So that's the short answer. Just find the thing that the person loves and give it to them. When we catch kids and we want to turn them into readers, what we should do and what smart teachers do, I think, is give them a whole bookshelf to choose from. You could read Tom Sawyer. You could read Harry Potter. You could read comic books or graphic novels, or you could read Dr. Seuss. I don't care. Whatever strikes your fancy and you will enjoy, you should start with. And then when you find something that you enjoy, then the teacher can say, oh, if you like that, here are these 12 more books that you might also like, and you sort of draw them in. The first one's free, kids. Then we start loading you up. Is reading good for you? Absolutely. But why is reading good for you, and why is it enjoyable? There are so many things that reading does for us. The most practical, I think, in today's sort of crazy age is that it makes us calm and happy. It calms us down and gives us a place to escape from traffic and the internet and politics and everything. And I think this is probably the oldest reason, that it gives us an escape, right? And probably the most well-loved. It takes us out of what we can't deal with at the moment, or we don't want to deal with, and puts us in a place where we can get absorbed and fall down whatever rabbit hole we're of our choice, and exist somewhere else. Now that's good for us in itself, just escapism, because if the world is rough and you can go somewhere else, great. Come back stronger. And that's kind of what the stories do, right? There's usually, especially in the stuff that I teach, somebody who goes somewhere else, learns something, and comes back. So this is form following function, right? You go someplace else, even if it's in a book or in your mind or whatever, and you get stronger, you get some space, you get some distance, you get some perspective, and you come back. And so Gilgamesh goes forth and comes back with the water of life, and gives it to his people, whatever. All the stories are similar in that way, that you learn something. And so we do that. Reading is good for you. Now there's all sorts of interesting research about reading building empathy. And we're worried about that, right? Because empathy has gone down. American children, something like 40%. I don't know how they test this, but 40% in the last 20 years. And we're blaming the internet. Okay, I mean, maybe that's true, maybe that's practical. But one thing that can combat that is to sink a kid into Harry Potter for hours at a time and read through people dealing with bullies and bad guys and problems and things, and then see how other people deal with those problems, and then come back and kind of apply that to your life. We do it without thinking. Nobody reads Harry Potter to think, I wonder how I shall deal with my bully in school. We don't. We read it because it's delightful. But we get stuff sort of piggybacked on that we don't plan for or don't work for. But I do think the other thing that we read for is to remember. And we can, this works orally too, right? So we have stories to remember. But we have stories to remember a lot of things, right? Not just the oral folk tales and things like that are full of history. They're full of past eras. The epics and things are full of family members. We read to sort of know we're not alone, but we also read to remember other people who came before us and whose stories match our own or inform our own. I think we read to remember or tell stories to remember our own youth, to remember who we were, to remember what our life was like before this part of it changed or before that part of it changed. And that's a function of story that has been in use, if it's oral, if it's visual, if it's text, if it's whatever. We read to remember. So, yes, we should read, by all means.
I'm kind of laughing to myself because you mentioned Harry Potter, and I wrote something here. I didn't know you were going to talk about Harry Potter. Let me read to you exactly what I wrote. It's going to take a second, but here's what I've written, and you can respond to it. Every summer, my wife reads the Harry Potter series all the way through. When she finishes one volume, we watch the corresponding movie that night. She owns all the DVDs for the series. She's been observing this ritual for at least 5 years now. Now, here's another fact.
If you go to Amazon right now, the week of August 5th, 2018, you will see that Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone is number 8 in the most sold column. And in the most read column, it is number 1. What's more, there is a Harry Potter volume in positions 4, 5, and 9, and the remaining 3 books in that series occupy positions 11, 13, and 14. In other words, of the top 14 spots in the most read column at Amazon right now, half of them were written more than 11 years ago, and they tell the story of a boy wizard and his friends. What's going on? Why is that? Why do so many people read Harry Potter? Why does my wife read Harry Potter every year? Please enlighten me.
Wow. Okay, so when you first started reading, I was unsure of whether or not this was your wife or this was just an anecdote. But this is your wife, isn't it?
It is really my wife.
I think that's delightful.
You can't make this stuff up, Alison, you know.
Well, I mean, as a mom, I read them all to my children at various points. I waited for for them to grow up a little bit for some of the later ones, but I've read them all at least 4 times through to them, and the earlier ones more. Why is the story awesome? Oh, so many reasons. The story is, first of all, it's a formula that sells. I actually saw a meme trying to say that J.R.R. Tolkien ripped off Rowling's formula because, you know, he has the same kind of journey and the same kind of bad guy. It's like, no. See, this is the case for knowing what came before, because it takes you, it is a genre of children's lit, a portal journey that you go through a portal like Narnia. You go through the wardrobe or something, or you go through the wall at platform 9 3/4. You go through whatever, you get the rabbit hole to get to this other world. This is a standard children's lit trope, but it comes from our grown-up lit as well. That you have to go somewhere else where it's completely different and yet strangely parallel. Do things that you couldn't normally do in the world, you know, especially children. They can't do so much. So you go to this other world where you suddenly can do all the things. You can clean your house with a snap of your fingers, right? Watch Mrs. Weasley cook up a dinner without stepping near the stove. You know, those sort of appeal to a mom. But they appeal to a kid too, right? The gnomes and the craziness and the spells and the unlimited power and the things that you could do in this world that you couldn't ever dream of doing in another world. All of that appeals. And then when you have this world that you can go to and come back from, there's power in that too, you know, that you do fun stuff in this other world and then you come back to your old world and you have to sort of go through the motions, but you know stuff. You know that there's this other world out there, and that gives you strength to proceed through, you know, dealing with the Dudley Dursleys of the world. And then, I mean, there's lots. It's big. There's this horrible, horrible bad guy. And this horrible bad guy it gets worse and worse, and you sort of uncover more and more, so it leads you on down this path as the books get more advanced and darker, and you see the connections that you didn't see earlier, and so you sort of grow into the books as you go, and they get more complex. That's delightful and useful for kids and adults. And then you come back. There is a battle. You work up to combating this horrible, horrible thing and winning. And by God, if you can do that, then you can do it in other places too. That's empowering. So all of that connects. The other thing that, because I'm my particular kind of geek, is she's drawn from all these wonderful traditions of she has centaurs and she has wizards, and she didn't make up any of that, you know. She drew that from all over the place, and so it rings bells that we know. Oh, I remember that from my childhood, or I remember that from whatever, and they're all here suddenly, and you sort of feel smart for recognizing them, but you also see them in a new context, and it's utterly delightful and all sort of orchestrated together. I think the thing that I love about her the most is how planned and intricate they are, and how they all sort of connect at the end. All the little threads sort of tie up, and she's been laying groundwork for 7 books, and here it comes to fruition. I love that.
Great. I want to talk to you more about reading, but before I do that, I know that you're a blogger and that you've been blogging for some time now. In fact, I think you're getting ready to pass the 100 blog mark. Maybe tell us a little bit about what your blog is about, What were or are your motives for writing?
Well, so the blog started as I wanted to write. I've reached a point in my life when I've read a lot, and I've done a lot, and I've taught people a lot, and I'm ready to turn that into stuff that's meaningful for me and spit some back out into the world. I have, as an academic, I publish academic papers to get tenure and things like that, but that's not really where my heart lies. I've been doing that because I need to and because I enjoy the subject matter, but mostly it's about teaching, some about the books, but this blog is about what I want to talk about. And what I want to talk about is mostly the sort of linchpin of the thing is reading, but reading means a whole lot for me. Reading books for pleasure and delight in the evening, reading to children. I've raised 2 children. They're one's starting college in the fall and one's a junior in high school. And I've read to them their whole lives. Reading out loud, I do a lot, since I teach the old literature, a lot of that was performed orally. It was read out loud, meant to be heard aloud. I do that in class, and sometimes it's the most rewarding experience my students have, as they read the Nibelungenlied out loud as if it were performed in a medieval court or something. I think that all of those different things are interesting to me. How children learn to read, what kinds of things we read and what kinds of things we prefer to hear. Fairy tales, we hear a lot of fairy tales, and they were originally in oral form. The epics I read are oral. Your blog, or your your podcast is going to be in oral form. I'm interested in all of how those connect and what we get out of each medium. Some of them are about my family. They get sort of more personal. I've read to my parents. My father declined in dementia over the last several years and passed away. And I read to him and what that experience was like. And all of it sort of centers around reading, but reading is very big for me.
Yeah. I'm touched by what you said about your dad and reading to him, and I'm wondering would you be willing to say a little bit more about reading to your parents?
So my mom had paranoid schizophrenia. It's complicated. And as she was in sort of delusionary modes, I would read to her and pull her kind of out of that and back into the present. And my dad had sort of standard run-of-the-mill dementia that accelerates and gets further and further. And when he was first put into assisted living, he could listen to me read for about half an hour, and it calmed him. And as he went further and further down the dementia track, about 10 minutes, and about 5 minutes, and then about a minute. And then I got so that I would just bring one little poem and read that over and over. But it was calming. It was a place where he felt comfortable and contact,
Yeah.
He didn't want people yelling directions at him, and he didn't want them telling him to eat his applesauce. He wanted just to sit quietly and hear some words of comfort from somebody he loved,
I sent you an article that Adam Kirsch recently wrote in the Wall Street Journal entitled How We Read Now. And he points out in that article that according to a new survey, many, if not most people reading today, they don't read and aren't reading the classic literature that we English teachers have been telling them they should be reading all these years. Instead, they read books that are often not all that well written by our standards, what might be called pulp fiction, books that emphasize mostly plot, page turners or pot boilers. They're really not high on style. So my question to you is this a bad thing? Should we be worried about that? How should we think about that?
I think over the years I have taught a senior English class, which you took, the Senior Symposium, and it's sort of a capstone course to wrap up the English literature major. So this is a very particular audience, a very particular kind of person who takes a degree in English literature, right? A reader of a particular kind. But when I do that, one day I devote to talking about what kind of readers they are or what they read for. And I start and I say, over the years I've learned that there are people who are sort of plot junkies or plot fiends, people who just love plot and they read for the story. And these kinds of people don't put books down. They keep turning the page. They keep wanting to know what's going to happen. They tend to read fast. They tend not to dwell on the little details. They tend to not remember all the little details, but they want to get to the end. And so that's one type. And I think that's the type that we're going to end up talking about generally as the most popular in America. But this is an English class for the time being, and I get all these crazy people from all different backgrounds. It's a state school. They're not raised in ivory towers. A lot of them are first-generation college students. What are they reading for? Some of them read for character. So, and my husband, who is a biochemistry major and instructor, reads for character. He's not an English major. He reads to get to know people, and some of my students do. They look for themselves. They look for I want to identify with the main character. There are some who, if they don't like anyone in the whole book, they put the book down by chapter 2. They can't, that's their entry point. They want to identify with a character or find a character they like or want to learn from or emulate. And if they're all reprehensible, that's a deal breaker. So there are those. And then my husband is that person, and these people read like that, who when you make a movie out of the book, you better be very careful with those characters because the characters had a life in this book. And if you mess it up for the movie, they will hate that movie. So my husband hates the second Harry Potter movie because of that. So there are those people who read for character and who find bits of themselves. That's what I think they're doing. I think they're figuring themselves out, watching somebody else work through problems like I did. I was the youngest of 3 children, and my brother and sister were quite a lot old, 7 and 8 years older than me. And I watched them make mistakes, and then I said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. So I think that's what these people get out of books is they read and they say, oh, geez, you really blew that one. Adults never do that. So you don't say that, you don't do that, or you do. You find really great lines, and hey, that worked. That was good. So they're character people. They're plot people. They're character people. There are, especially in an English class, form people. I just said I liked how Rowling structured all her books and how all of the building blocks she set in place early on came back and resonated in book 7 and things like that. There are people who really look for that sort of balance and symmetry and architecture and find that very satisfying. And some of them say, I am a formalist. This is what I do. And then there are, I don't have a nice term for what I do, but I read for symbols and really great lines. I'm probably the aesthete, right? Like I always read with a pencil because if I'm reading a 500-page book and there's a really beautiful line halfway through, I don't want to lose it. So I mark it and I dog-ear it and I circle it and I comment on it. And I will remember, though I read slowly, and I will remember those really excellent lines or that really beautiful turn of phrase or that really crystalline scene. I'll work that through in my head over and over again and see it and build it and construct it. And then be mad at the movie if they blow it, But I look at sort of the poetry. I look for poetry in fiction. I look for really beautiful style and really deep, interesting, connecting sort of symbols. And then the last group, so that's 4. The last group are the feelers. These guys, and I think there's more and more of them, there certainly are in my classes, people who claim that they read for just immersion. They want to escape, they want to be completely immersed in their text, and they want to not be able to hear or think about or worry about anything else for a while. They want to just lose themselves and then come back. But be able to lose them, know that that's a gateway that they can go almost, it's not, but almost like a drug. If you go there, you know you're going to have that feeling. You know what that feels like, and you can go to it and enjoy it and roll around it and come back and deal with life. So those are the 5, I've been doing this class 15 years now. If those are the 5 kinds of English majors, readers that I run across, and this survey says mostly America are plot junkies. What do I have to say about that? I'm not worried about that. I think that finding out what happens is as noble a goal. That for one thing, that means that you read more. The plot junkies tend to go through books more and more and more because they don't spend 3 days rolling around on page 72 with that beautiful image. They trounce through books. There's credence to me for the plot junkie line. That we need stories. We need to know. We need to hear what other people have done, and that there are ways that we can make our world work out. And that transcends the pages of a novel.
One thing that Kirsch believes is that people today have a hunger for epic stories. That's what he says. And he believes this. He can't prove it, but he thinks that most people don't care where they get their stories, whether it's through reading a book or watching a movie, maybe even listening to it as an audiobook. It's just that people have a hunger for stories. And he concludes by saying that before literary style, people need sustenance. They're always going to choose sustenance before style. In other words, Kirsch believes that stories sustain us in some sense, that stories are vital for living and continuing to live, that we can't live without stories. Putting it differently, he's saying that if we don't have stories, we're going to die in some way. Do you think that's true? Do we really need stories to live?
I think it is. I think it's absolutely vital that we have some way to think things through, that we have some way to learn about other options and other ways to approach problems, that we don't feel alone. When you read a story or you hear a story and you see somebody going through, because you see it in your mind, whether you read it or hear it, you see somebody going through problems that you've had or that you have feared, not even that you've had, but what if you were worried about something happening? I mean, some of us have never faced a Voldemort, right? But we worry about big things, even if we don't face them ourselves. But if you see them overcome, I mean, C.S. Lewis said that about fairy tales, right? We don't read fairy tales we read fairy tales to see that the dragon can be overcome, right? I think that's important. I think we need to feel that other people have the same problems. We need to feel connected to other people, and reading can do that. It doesn't matter if it's written 3,000 years ago by somebody I had nothing in common with, materially.
Really, it seems like what we're saying is it's not so much reading that is the important thing, but stories and finding our way towards stories. And you're right. For the most of history, people were illiterate. They couldn't read at all. And yet they found their way to stories. And these stories were in some sense life-sustaining, that they were transmitting life to people in some sense. They were transmitting life. And maybe that's what I really want to say on this podcast, Alison. Thank you for helping me think this through. Maybe what I want to say to people is, words and stories actually are health-giving and life-giving. And one way to get those words is to read them and seek out those words. You can actually help yourself therapeutically. You don't need to drink something or ingest something. It can relieve stress. It can actually help. And I just did a show on suicide. And of course, what happens with people who become suicidal is their perspective keeps shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and they become more and more isolated and alone. And reading can actually be perhaps a balm or a small good thing for people.
Absolutely. A lifeline, a connector.
A lifeline. That's the show. That's what I want to say.
I am so grateful to have had Dr. Alison Baker on this program. Please see the show notes for all kinds of links to her. Especially, you may want to take a look at some of the moving words that she wrote about her mom and dad on her blog. The closing music, In the Hall of the Mountain King, is performed by Grieg. In the middle of the program was Long Road Ahead by Kevin MacLeod. And of course, there was the unforgettable theme music from the Harry Potter movies, written and directed by the incomparable John Williams. The next episode will be different. It will be longer, much less edited, because I'll be talking to Andrew Cochran and Ryan Zarakani, the hosts and brains at Seated in Action, a podcast that is nothing like mine. Won't that be refreshing? I think you're definitely going to want to listen in on that show where we talk about, well, all kinds of things. Thanks for listening.